as an investor, what is your outlook on the European banks as a class, both equity and debt?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we're fairly bearish. We don't see the most value in the European banking sector at all. And I think some of what Nick had to say before just about Deutsche and certainly Barclays, I think there's a lot of question marks there. I mean, I think the fundamental issue is capitalization, right? And many of these banks are undercapitalized overall. There's some exceptions in the sector. For those like Barclays and Deutsche that have a heavy reliance or a relatively heavy reliance on investment banking, when they're not really getting the same kind of lift that they are getting from their U.S. counterparties, that's an issue. Certainly with Deutsche, you've got the overhang with the DOJ settlement, which I think is one that concerns us. And in the case of Barclays, we don't really know when that African business sale is going to come, for example. In the case of Deutsche, we don't really know whether they're going to have to sell that asset management business or IPO it. So a lot of questions, and that's, I think, pretty representative in many ways of a lot of banks where we just don't know if they're going to be able to, how they're going to raise and when they're going to raise the capital that they need to really compete. And so equity is an area where, relative to other sectors in Europe, we're not as bullish.
But what about debt? Because we may not know what their profit outlook is or what the future of the bank is, but they're probably going to be able to pay their debts.
Yeah.
And are the markets overreacting on the negative side, on the debt side?
I think they are, but I think what depends a little bit is what banks, what countries. So, for example, again, it gets back to capitalization. It gets back to the countries that you're in and what the fundamental business that you're in is. So, for example, in some of the Italian bank side, I don't know that we really worry about repayment, but we certainly worry about, you know, what's the right value. But then we see banks like ING that I think we look at both from a debt and even maybe an equity side, and we say, you know what, I think we see good value there because of the capitalization, because of the overall fundamentals of their operating model.
Rob, let's just talk about management. If you're invested in some of these companies, you should have an idea of what you want those companies to be. So let's solve all of Europe's problems. They're recapitalized. Everything's great. What is the strategic aim of some of these banks? What should they become? Through 2007, it was, let's do the whole Wall Street investment banking thing. Let's turn Deutsche Bank into Goldman Sachs. Great. That hasn't worked. We move on. So let's say they're recapitalized. What do they become? What are they meant to be?
Well, I think it depends a lot on the operating model of each company. I don't think you can just say that one size fits all. But I think for a lot of the companies, it means getting back to their knitting of being strong retail and commercial lenders in their regional areas. I think being the kind of wholesale universal bank that many of them became, and Deutsche is a perfect example, kind of the global supermarket and competing that way. I just don't see that as being the right model for most European banks. And so I think that being much more focused on their segments, growing margins there in areas that are friendly to them where they've really got a competitive advantage, to me, that's the area they ought to focus on.
Rob, expand it out from financials to Europe more generally. You mentioned ING. Mm-hmm. Do you see opportunities in investing in Europe right now?
We definitely do. In fact, we think, generally speaking, in a number of sectors, Europe is undervalued, certainly relative to the U.S. in the equity markets overall. And although there's been relatively slow anemic growth, we think the ECB will continue with their asset purchases. And we think that while there may be some changes, we think that'll continue beyond December. So we actually think that European stocks generally are undervalued, and we think that that's a better place right now than the U.S. overall to be investing in equity.